Welcome or welcome back to the 9th Annual Life Sciences and Society Symposium, Claiming Kin. We have a wonderful collection of speakers this weekend for you. We've already heard 2 fantastic speakers, and I'm just here to introduce our introducer. Frank Schmidt, who's a professor of biochemistry, will come out and introduce Charmaine Royal for what is going to be a really exciting talk.
Good morning, kinfolk, and I don't use that term loosely, because if there's one thing that we've discovered over the growth of the human genetics program over the last 20 years is that not only are we all kinfolk in greater degrees than we recognized, but we have kinfolk that we don't even know, Neanderthals and Denisovians and so forth, some of which are only known from little bits of biological fragments. This actually does carry some profound implications that we have not really come to grips with as a society or as a profession. And so in that spirit, I'm really pleased to introduce Charmaine Royal. Charmaine is a native of Jamaica. She received her bachelor's degree and her master's degree in genetic counseling from Howard University in Washington. She did a PhD in human genetics there, a postdoctoral fellowship at NIH, and then went back home as a member of the faculty of Howard. In 2007, however, she showed that Potomac fever is not a terminal disease by moving to Duke University, where she is a member of the African American Studies Department and the Bioethics Center at the Duke Human Genomics Center. So before I begin, I ought to thank all of our sponsors, but I'm only going to thank one out loud. If you look on the program, read the list, or look up here, and I'll count them as thanked. But this is also part of Saturday Morning Science, which, for those of you who've never been to it, is an unusual program of science communication to the public, sponsored by a number of people. For those of you who are here from schools and so forth and need to sign in, head to the desk out in the lobby of Jesse Hall, and I'm sure they'll be glad to take your name and get it to you. And also to remind you, Saturday Morning Science will not happen next week or the week after. It will resume on April 6th after spring break. So Charmaine's title is Reconceptualizing Identity and Kinship Insights from Genetic Ancestry Testing. Let's please welcome her.
Thank you, Frank. Oh, wow. It's great to be here. I was really thrilled when Frank called to invite me to come. I've been trying to cut back on my travel, and I thought, oh, I can't do another talk. But it's one of the topics that I'm very interested in. It's one of my areas of research. And I'm looking forward to talking with you about ancestry testing. Frank talked about Neanderthal and Denisovians, and I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk primarily about relationships to groups that we may not have thought we were related to, even more so than individuals. My title, Reconceptualizing Identity and Kinship. And I'm really going to start out by giving you some background in terms of the methodologies and the technologies that are used to do ancestry testing, and I'll talk about what ancestry testing is, ancestry inference. I'm going to talk a little bit about the genetic testing industry, just a little bit about that. And then I'm going to talk about a study that I've done and I'm continuing to do with colleagues on people who have had genetic ancestry inference and genetic ancestry testing and the kinds of experiences that they're having and have had and what they're saying about it. And we're going to wrap up with the so what. What does this all mean for us and the intersection of science and society? All right? So I have a lot to get through, so I may run through some things, but hopefully we'll have a lot of time for questions and answers. All right, so I'm going to start out, and I knew that this was going to be a very mixed audience, so I tried to make my slides pretty simple. I mean, some of them have a lot of information, and we're going to get through that information. But in terms of identity, and I have just 3 bullet points here in terms of some of the dimensions of identity, and the dimensions of identity that I'm going to focus on today. There are lots of other things that we could talk about. But I'm going to talk about the intersections between personal identity, how you see yourself, how I see myself, how I think about myself in terms of my identity. And the identity that I'm focusing on here, again, we have all different kinds of identity. And I'm going to be focusing mostly on what we call racial, quote unquote, and I'm not going to get into the whole race debate, even though that is necessarily part of the discussion, but that could be a whole separate talk. But we're gonna have the discussion later on. But what we call racial identity, and I use it in quotes because I'm one of those geneticists who don't believe that human groups subdivide into biological races, and so I tend to use it in quotes. And so we're going to talk about racial and ethnic identity and how we think about them in our society, how we think about them individually. So how people see themselves in terms of their ethnicity and their ethnic group, how society sees them or how others see them, and then what does genetics say about that? And how do we reconcile that? There are lots of conflicts there, as you're going to see later on in some of the responses of people to their genetic ancestry test results. So we're going to look at how these things come together, how they are separate, but also how they intersect. And then we're here to talk about kinship. And so in terms of even thinking about kin and kinship, I'm really going to let you decide what is kinship and what is kin, and who decides who is kin and who is not, who's in the group and who's outside of the group. We're going to be able to talk a lot about that today. So there are lots of meanings of kin and kinship, and depending on the disciplines, those meanings might change. But kinship and kin is also not static, it's dynamic, it changes over time. People are constantly reconstructing and restructuring their definitions and their identities in terms of who their people are. And that's really kind of how I want you to think about what I'm going to talk about today is who are my people? Who are my people? And in thinking about the dynamic and static elements of identity, the bottom three bullets there are just some of the areas in which we think about kinship, and I'm going to focus on genealogy in terms of my talk. But biomedicine, as a genetic counselor, one of the things we do is to take pedigrees and to look at people's health history, family health history. That's another way of thinking about kinship. In that case, we want only people to whom you're biologically related, because that will help us think about what you might be at risk for. But in terms of human development and family studies, I think there's a much broader definition. We think about fictive kin and all kinds of different functional and structural ways of thinking about families and relationships within families. And then there's genealogy, in terms of thinking about who am I related to. And not just the people, what I'm going to talk about today is not just the people in my nuclear family, not just my parents, my grandparents, but thinking about ancestors even way back before them, and what genetics can tell us and what it cannot tell us about our relationships to ancestors long ago who are dead and gone, who we don't even know and never knew we had. Okay, so I'm going to talk just very briefly about some of the tools that are used to determine or to infer or to estimate genetic ancestry. And these tools that I'm going to talk about are tools that were developed not in industry. These are tools that primarily were developed in academia by researchers, anthropological geneticists and population geneticists who do work in terms of populations and population relationships and population migrations. And these tools were developed, have been developed over time, and now they've gone into the direct-to-consumer industry. Many of those companies, which I'll talk about the companies in a minute, are also headed by scientists who are also in academia as well as industry. So there are two broad categories of tests that are used to infer ancestry, and are used both in research and in direct-to-consumer genetic testing. I'm going to focus, again, as I said, on the direct-to-consumer individuals who want to find out about their ancestry, and not so much on research, because it would just make the talk too long. So I'm going to focus on these two categories in terms of individual and personal genetic ancestry testing. So there are these two main groups, are the lineage tests and the autosomal tests. And I know there are many people here who know that, so I'm not going to get into too much detail about that. But in terms of lineage tests, there are two tests that are done, and two methods that are used. And one is maternal, tracing your maternal lineage, and using mitochondrial DNA that is passed down from mother to child, unchanged, pretty much unchanged. And then we use the Y chromosome to look at paternal ancestry, using what we call the non-recombining part of the Y chromosome. And when we think about lineage tests and the information that we get from lineage tests, very different from the information that we get from the other tests that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So just a very simple pedigree here. The arrow is pointing to the person that we would call the proband in genetics, so the person who's looking to find out about their ancestry. So that's the person to whom the arrow is pointing. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at the mitochondrial DNA. So that person who's trying to find out about their maternal lineage, their maternal ancestry, is getting information about, when they do a mitochondrial DNA test, they're getting information about their mother up the line. They're not getting information about their father from the mitochondrial test. And similarly with the Y, a man who's trying to find out about his ancestry on his father's side is getting information about his father's 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 father. There's not a lot of information that you're getting from these tests about the people in between. And the people who critique, there are lots of papers that have been written about the limitations of ancestry testing. And we're going to talk about some of the problems and the limitations, who are concerned about these people in between that people are not getting information about, and that people who are getting these tests are thinking they're getting a whole lot of information, but they're not. But when we look at the data in terms of what people are saying, then we'll see a whole different story in terms of how people even understand these tests. So the other group of tests is the autosomal test, or what some people call the admixture test, or the biogeographical ancestry test. And this is newer than the lineage test. Lineage tests have been around for a long time. The autosomal test, or the admixture test, are tests that use not the mitochondrial or the Y or the sex chromosomes. These use only the autosomes. That's your chromosomes 1 to 22, right? Not the Y, not the X. They use the autosomes. And they use what we call ancestry informative markers. And these are genetic markers, sequences of DNA, that have been found to be highly frequent in particular populations. So they use these markers to help to trace people's ancestries to particular populations based on the frequency of these markers or these sequences in different populations. And that's the more common one. We can also use whole genome scans, looking at the whole genome, looking at ancestry informative markers across the genome, but not as widely as used as the admixture mapping, as the Ames scans. All right. So one of the things that I get asked about a lot is the accuracy of these tests. And I'm talking about the accuracy because before we go into talking about what people are saying, because it will help you to understand some of the issues with people's responses to their test results. So in 2010, some colleagues and I were charged with, I think it was in 2008 we got the charge, from the American Society of Human Genetics to do a white paper on ancestry inference. Ancestry inference, not just in industry or in the direct-to-consumer marketing environment, but ancestry inference in both research and in industry. And this short list of points to consider when we think about accuracy came from that paper. And there are four main things that we think about in terms of how accurate are these tests? How can I tell that when they say I trace to this group, it's really true and that those percentages that I'm getting are true? And the first one is distribution of human variation, human genetic variation. We're still trying to understand human genetic variation. There's a lot that we don't know, a lot that we don't understand. And so how human genetic variation is distributed globally will invariably have an impact on what we're able to tell people about their ancestry and who they're traced to. And because we're still trying to understand that information in terms of human variation across the globe, there is limitation in terms of what we are able to tell folks. How we survey that diversity, what markers we use, whether we use the AIMS or the lineage test, those make a difference in terms of how accurate or how specific we can be and what kind of information we can give, and who was sampled in terms of trying to even study that diversity. Then there are reference samples. When someone does a test, they give a sample of DNA, usually a cheek swab, and I'm gonna just talk a little bit about that in a minute. And they're matching the DNA that they get from that cheek swab with DNA that's in a database, right? With lineages, information that comes from populations across the globe. And they match that with a reference sample. So what's in your reference sample will invariably have an impact on what you get out, what you're able to tell people, whether they have a match or not. Very, very important. That's actually one of the key issues in terms of the accuracy and the reliability of genetic ancestry inference, because no reference sample is complete, is comprehensive. We don't have lineages for all populations globally, so there will be some missing. So what happens in those cases? We're going to talk about that. And of course, population genetics is a statistical exercise. How significant, how closely does this match with that? It's statistics. And the statistical methods that are used help to determine how accurate the information is that you're going to get. So this is pretty much a representation of the companies out there. There are about 38, 40 companies. One of my postdocs recently, we published a paper of the companies. We did a survey of the companies using their websites, looking at what kind of information they give consumers, looking at how many companies there are out there. This is probably the most comprehensive review of the companies using their websites. We actually sent a survey out because we wanted to get some more information, and only 2 companies responded to the survey. And I talked to a couple of them later on, and I think they already feel targeted because they've been criticized so much that they were fearful of responding to the surveys. And of course, once I talked to them, they're like, oh yeah, send it to us now. By then it was too late. We were done. We were writing our paper and we were moving along. But there's a variety of services that these companies offer. I'm sure many of you have heard about 23andMe, and it's one of those that offers the most comprehensive. They do health-related testing. They test for traits. They also do ancestry. But then you have companies like African Ancestry, which is owned by one of my colleagues, and I'll talk about some research that he and I are doing. His work focuses primarily on African ancestry that only do ancestry testing, right? So there are companies like 23andMe and like even Decode. Where's Decode? Decode should be somewhere here. I don't see Decode. Yeah, there we go, right. Decode is another one of those that does a broad range of things. But many of the others, and you can look and kind of tell which ones focus on genealogy and which ones focus on ancestry. And these companies are varied. They do different things. They give results back in different ways, and the costs vary. The cost for a genetic ancestry test could go anywhere from $99. The Genographic Project costs $99 to $1,200, $1,200. And you get different things from these companies. Some of them do all those tests that I talk about, lineage plus autosomal. Some only do autosomal, some only do lineage. Some give you a CD of the population that you trace to, all kinds of things. T-shirts, all kinds of things they do. All kinds of things. There's quite a range in terms of the scope. So why are people interested in this stuff? In some studies, these 2 papers are papers that were done by 2 postdocs of mine, former postdocs, in looking at why people are interested in genetic ancestry testing, why are people interested in using genetic information to help find out where they're coming from, where their family's from, where their ancestors came from. And the primary reason that we got was genealogy. People are interested in finding out more about their family. But some people also wanted to find out about their identity, who they are. And we got that a lot from people, from African Americans, and much of what I do focuses on African American, African identity and ancestry. And many African Americans, at least in the US, my hypothesis is that it will be different in different parts of the world, including Jamaica, where I'm from. But I find that African Americans in particular feel this sense of loss in terms of what they know about their ancestry because of the disruption that the Middle Passage created in terms of ancestors that they don't know anything about. And so this desire to connect with my family and know who I am, personal identity was major. Some people just want to know. I just want to know. The information is out there. I just want to know. That's all I want to do. I just want to know. And for some, it's just entertainment, what many geneticists tend to call recreational genetics. They call ancestry testing recreational genetics. And then you have those that say they want to find out about their ancestry so they can find out about health risks, health problems that they may be at risk for. Now that can be a little bit of a stretch because you're thinking about ancestors. These tests are telling you about ancestors a long time ago. The mitochondrial DNA test, depending on the database, could date back to mitochondrial Eve, which is 150,000 years ago, right? Most companies give a more recent time frame and will give you information within the last 100,000 years to 500 years ago. The admixture test gives you a more recent time frame. The admixture test tends to be pre-Columbian, so pre-1492. So the admixture test, depending again on the databases that you're using, depending on the markers that you're using, could give you information in terms of ancestors, say 50,000 years ago to 500 years ago, and everything in between. Again, the databases, the markers, the lineages for mitochondrial tests determine how far back you can get information about your ancestors. So who is purchasing these tests? We don't know. We don't know, and that's one of the things that we wanted to survey the companies to find out. There are many people who feel that there are more African Americans purchasing these tests than anyone else because of the experience of African Americans in the US, but we really don't know that for sure. And I'm not even sure how the companies are not giving that information up. I think 23andMe did give some information the other day about who's buying all their tests, because they bundle their tests. So you get the health-related plus the ancestry tests in one bundle, but you can always go on and select what you really want to see because you create an account. But many of the companies are not telling you how many people are purchasing their tests. So that's information that we really still don't know how many people and what the demographics of these people are. So many of you are probably familiar with some of these media-related things in terms of ancestry testing. We have Thomas Jefferson over there and Sally Hemings, and that was actually, the information about the relationship came through research in terms of Jefferson being related to Sally Hemings and what's happening there now in the family, and questions about who is kin and who's not. I mean, because genetics says you're my kin, that doesn't mean that I think you are, and that doesn't mean that you're part of the family. We're going to talk a bit about that. But some of you may know about African American Lives. That was done by Skip Gates, and he's done quite a number of things there, including the finding Oprah's roots. In African American Lives, I don't know how many people may have seen that, with Oprah thinking that she's Zulu, hoping that she was Zulu, finding out that she's not Zulu, and was not very happy about it. She had this affinity, this feeling of kinship with the Zulu, and it's one of the reasons that she started the school that she did in South Africa. But the tests show that she's related to Liberia. Their ancestors trace to Liberia, but she's always had this thing for the Zulu. And of course, people who study African American history are like, where does the Zulu come into the Middle Passage in terms of coming to the U.S. But then there's this story over here, which some of you might know about. This story, this woman in New York did ancestry testing and found that she's related to this man. He's from right here in Missouri, a cattle farmer in Missouri. And they're kin, according to the genetic ancestry test. And they were on 60 Minutes, and this real kumbaya thing about happy to find my cousin, my long-lost cousin. We find a lot of that kind of thing. And some of you may know about George Lopez's show looking at people's ancestry and people being surprised about who they're related to and who they're not, and how much percent white and who's not. So all kinds of things have been going on in terms of genetic ancestry. Motherland is a documentary that was done in the UK, looking at people who are in the UK, and I'm just trying to keep track of oh my goodness. I thought I was keeping track of my time. I didn't turn on my timer. I hope somebody is, Stephanie. I don't want to go too long. How much do I have? How much time do I? Oh, this is not good. All right. Okay, let me run along. Let me and this is just a representation of how some of the companies give the information to customers, all kinds of ways that they communicate the information. All right, so I'm going to go into talking about a study. Wow, okay, going to try to get through this. So these are some of the issues that people have raised in terms of their concerns with ancestry testing. I'm going to really focus on the first 2, and 3 to some degree is connected to those. But the reshaping of identity. So number of social scientists and bioethicists have written about concerns about genetic ancestry testing, what it tells people, what it doesn't tell people, what the limitations are, and how people need to understand this and incorporate it into their lives. And I'm going to focus a bit on that reshaping of identity, people getting unexpected and unwanted results. Like there's this man we talked with, and I'm going to talk about some of my data, but in terms of unwanted, we interviewed this man whose ancestry traced to some group in Nigeria. Well, for some reason, he didn't want to be related to the Nigerians. So his hypothesis that his people moved to Nigeria at some point. So he's not Nigerian, so he will not take that on. But other people respond. People respond so in so many different ways in response to when they get their test results. And conflicts about group membership, who's in, who's out. We're going to talk a bit about that in terms of some Native American groups that we've worked with. And all of these different things. I'm not going to go into those. So I'm just going to move on. So I did a study a couple of years ago with my colleague Rick Kittles, who is the founder and scientific director of African Ancestry. We were colleagues at Howard at the time. And he and I always had this discussion about, he started this company when he was faculty at Howard. He's now in Chicago. But when he started the company, there was a lot of question about using this genetic information. And it was the first company to focus on African ancestry. The very first company in terms of genetic ancestry is Family Tree DNA, which started in 2000. So the industry is just a little over 10 years old, the direct-to-consumer industry. And so we started this study. I was interested in hearing what people are understanding, why people want this testing, and what they do with the results and how they understand it. So we did this study. It was really intended to be a very small pilot thing. We ended up with 400, almost 500 people in the study. And Rick always went around and did forums on African ancestry in communities, primarily African-American communities, where people want to hear about this stuff. So I did a study along with him where I developed a short survey, a very short survey, that I gave to people before they got their ancestry testing, and I gave them a post-test afterwards. And so what you're seeing here, what the paper on the pre-test is out. This is the paper on the post-test. So of the 400, almost 500 people that did the testing, had their DNA tested, 121 returned the post-test. So what I'm going to talk to you about is mostly the data from people after they got their results. So they did the pre-test. At the fora, we offered free genetic testing, and we did the autosomal test, the admixture test. And let me just tell you a little bit about the test. So when people get that result, so again, as I said, it combines fathers and mothers' autosomes, right? So it gives you a percentage of DNA, a percentage of ancestry, I should say, that you have in different, and again, there are all kinds of caveats to these. I'm saying them very simply, but it's not more complex than it sounds. But you get a percentage of ancestry in typically, and other companies are doing different things now, but typically 4 regions, 4 geographic regions, continental regions. And it's usually Europe, Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, and Native American, which is not a continental region, but it's one of the 4. And those are the 4 groups that people often get information about their ancestry. And so you get a percentage. So if you do a test, you could get something like you're 10% African and Sub-Saharan African, 20% European, 5% Native American, and so on. And it always adds up to 100, which is problematic, as those of you who are geneticists will understand, or people would know that there are problems with that. So this is just the demographics of the 121. One of the groups, so the study was done in 4 sites, Washington, D.C., Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm standing in front of this even though I don't really need it. Cincinnati, Ohio, Washington, D.C., New York, Harlem, New York, and Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. We really did a study in Norman, Oklahoma. And the Oklahoma group is the most interesting, and I'm going to focus on that group, although I'm going to talk about the whole study. But the Oklahoma group, that group was actually one of the instigators of this study. The freedmen, I don't know how many people in here know about the freedmen, the black freedmen in Oklahoma. And the freedmen are emancipated slaves that were slaves of the Native American tribes, and that they had, and as the tribes were forcibly moved from Florida up to Oklahoma and other places north, they took their slaves with them and they lived with them, and they became family. I mean, we have Buffalo soldiers who were soldiers who fought the Native Americans, but they ended up marrying and having wives and having families. And in 2004, actually over time, so the Native American tribes in the early 1900s, the federal government gave the tribes the authority to create a roll of people who would be entitled to some of the benefits that they would get from the government, particularly in terms of land allotment, right? And they created the Dawes Roll. It was created in 1906. And the way the tribes developed the Dawes Roll, it was created to include people who they believed had substantial Native American ancestry. So the freedmen, even though they lived with them, they fought with them through the Trail of Tears, helped them to deal with the US government. When the Dawes Roll was created, the freedmen were not, because they were not seen as qualifying by blood. And it's interesting how they think about blood but not genetics, but qualifying by blood, not qualifying by blood. So a separate role was created for the freedmen, and then there's a Dawes Roll. So now people who are saying that they have Native American ancestry, and one of them is here, Sylvia Davis, who's saying they have Native American ancestry, her name is not on the roll. And if your name is not on the roll that they created, then you're not going to be able to get any of the benefits. In 2000, about 2000, the Seminoles, so there's the tribes that in Oklahoma, there are 5 of them that are called the 5 civilized tribes of Oklahoma, and those are the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Seminole, the Choctaw, and the Cherokee. And those 5 tribes each have freedmen groups associated with them. And the freedmen, they have been in conflict for a long time because the tribes kicked out the freedmen, saying that they didn't belong. And the freedmen have been saying for years, we have Native Americans, we have ancestors, and here she is saying her ancestor was a Native American, but she can't prove it. Her name is not on the roll. And so they approached Rick Kittles, my buddy, to ask him to do ancestry testing for them to prove that they have Native American ancestry. And I don't know how many of you in here know anything about Native Americans and genetics and membership and blood quantum and all these things in terms of tribal rules. But for the most part, Native American tribes do not acknowledge genetics as a mark of membership. It's blood quantum. They think about it as blood quantum. So for the Seminoles, they instituted in 2000, when they kicked out the freedmen, they instituted a 1/8%. You have to have 1/8 ancestor, one great-grandfather who's a Native American for you to qualify. They don't think about that as genetics. It's blood quantum. So if you don't have an ancestor who's 1/8, or if you're 1/8 or less, then you can't be part of the tribe. And so they thought that they're going to do ancestry testing to prove that they have Native American ancestry. So we did the study, and I'm just going to present to you some of the results. And in looking at our data, very rich data, it was quantitative and qualitative, and I'm going to present primarily pretty much the qualitative, some of the qualitative data here. And we were able to divide the responses into 4 groups of people. And one of them is the people that we're calling the seeker confidence. So these are people who trust the test and what the results they got from the test, but they're going to continue doing other things. They're going to continue their genealogy research. Some of them are avid genealogists. And some of the quotes here, I can't wait to compare these results to my family tree. Another person said, I'll go to Africa to learn more about the group where I'm from. And we find that a lot of people do go to, particularly when they trace to African ancestry, they will go to those places and try to meet their family. And we found that the seeker confidence, that group of people was dominant in every site except Oklahoma. We did not find people who trusted the test and were willing to do more in terms of the test. Then we have the seeker skeptics. So these are people who don't trust the test, and they are seeking to disprove the test. So these are people who the test is not the final word in terms of their identity or their ancestry, and they question the science of ancestry inference. So this person said, this result is different from what I expected. I will do further testing. And a small group of people, less than 10% in most of the sites, we found a greater number of people in Oklahoma. Oklahoma, it was just so different from the other sites. And of course, we realize it's because of the experiences of those people. The closer confidence are the people who fundamentally trust the test. They are not going to question it. They're just going to file it away, and I'm going to pass it down to my children. Now I know who I am. Case is closed. Science has told me what I needed to know. Another person, my daughter has practiced Yoruba religion for years. Now she says it's only natural, a family tradition. We're Yoruba. We've been it all our lives. Science has just confirmed that. And then the closer skeptics are the people who don't trust the test and don't intend to follow it up. So they just compartmentalize the results, they just put it somewhere, and they're not going to challenge those results. So this person said, I'm a proud person and know who I am. My ancestry is Native American. That is what my parents said. This does not change anything. And again, we found a large number of these people from Oklahoma. So I'm going to quickly go through some cases of people, and I'm going to give you some of the information from their pre-test, and then their results, and then the post-test information. And you'll see how people think about this. So the first question, one of the questions on, and I'm going to try, I may not even do all of these. I'd probably just do a couple, because there's some things I want to do before I have to stop here. So one of the questions was, how much do you know about your ancestry? That was on the pre-test. And this person said, I'm 4th generation Choctaw from the 1800s, Chickasaw, whatever. Why do you want to know to do this testing? To know why I like and why I dislike certain things, the kinds of things that people think this is going to tell them. What are your concerns about this test? If the tests are used like the Germans, you know what they're talking about, right? And then the results that this person gets, 78% sub-Saharan African ancestry. And as you saw in the demographic table, most of these people were self-identified African American, but we also had people who identified as white and some other people from different ethnic groups. The result was 78% sub-Saharan, 22% European, 0% East Asian, and 0% Native American. There are comments after the test. Very different, because there's documented proof of Native ancestry in my bloodline, on my father's and mother's lineages, but 0% is reported by your test. I have cousins and uncles with Native American cards. What happened? Need more details. What are you going to do? Get a new test. And we find that a lot from people. They don't get a result that they want from one company, they'll go to another. And for those of you who do genetics, you know that they could probably get a different response from a different company. Again, as I said, there are several things that we need to think about. The databases. These companies have proprietary databases, right? their own, nobody knows what's in them, which is another issue that I'm not even going to get into. But the question about the databases, there's no way of verifying the information in databases because they are proprietary. There are companies, so they have the right to have their proprietary databases. But there is a lot of discussion about sharing the information in databases so people can verify that information. But people will go from company to company and get different results. It happens. What are you most concerned about? Inheritance loss. Are you satisfied with the test? No, not satisfied. Didn't get what I wanted. I'm not satisfied. Please retest in more depth. I need to know more. I have feathers of a Native American, and so did my great-grandmothers and paternal lineages. Next one. I know I have European and Mississippi Choctaw. I'm curious about having African ancestry because this is also something I heard in my family. What are they most concerned about? Diseases. Results, 4% sub-Saharan African, 96% European, 0% East Asian, 0% Native American. This is my favorite case to use. One whole side of my family, my father's, originates in Mississippi and has long insisted that we're Mississippi Choctaw. Now I question this family lore and wonder if instead that ancestor was African American and maybe living among the Choctaw people. I might write about this experience. I'll do some genealogical research to try to find this hidden branch of my family so I can reclaim them. I have always identified as part Mississippi Choctaw, and this test seems to call that into question. I feel a sense of ethnic vertigo. I mean, she really went on and on. I mean, this is just part of her response. Really, really, really deeply affected by this. That I'm not actually Native American and have been perpetuating a family lie in my own life and research. And you may not have been able to see the demographics. A lot of these people were professionals. And so she was a researcher, clearly. I have repeatedly publicly identified as part Indian, so now I know I'm part Black, but I'm no longer Native American. Would like to have the result explained a bit more. And her last question tells that she's someone who really does understand this testing. Does the test rule out ancestry if you get 0%? Or could it be that not all genetic markers have been included in the database, right? Because as we said, what's in the database determines what you get out. If someone has a marker or has ancestry from some group that's not included in your database, you're not gonna find a match. They'll get 0%, but it does not mean that they are 0%. It just means 0% based on what's in your database. And that's something I've talked to the companies about in terms of having caveats around the information that you get people. 0% just means 0% based on what you have. They could go to another company and get something else. I'm gonna try to wrap up soon. I'm probably just gonna have time to do one more because I have some other things I want to talk about. So how much do you know? My father's family is who came from, say, as slaves, not much. My mother is from Europe. 48% sub-Saharan and 39% East European. My test results were similar to what had been told about my ancestry, with the exception of now having a geographical location in West Africa. I plan on doing more research on my geographical location in West Africa, and I plan on telling all my friends about my African ancestry now that I have a place to name. I feel more of a complete person. We got that a lot. I feel like more of a complete person. Now I know who I am. Now I'm complete. Now I'm whole. That needs some anthropologists to tease that out and psychologists to tease that out. Now I'm whole, and now I know who I am. And what are you most concerned about? And I'm going to stop with this one and then move on to some of those. My father and my mother have Native American and African ancestry. What do you want to know? I want to know to be able to confirm heritage. I'm very excited to participate in this study. It is important for everyone to know where they came from. This information is shocking. To say that I have 0% Indian heritage or DNA is against everything I've been told by my parents. My mother is sure that her father was Native American. I'm not at all confident in your test. And the other is something that I'm really looking into, is how people share the information with. So this person decided not to share it with her mother because her mother would be upset. And we heard that quite a bit from people who did not. There's another one, I think here, who did not share it with his parents, with my parents. It was too much of a surprise regarding the no Native American. And my parents being the age that they are, I do not wish to upset them. I actually participated with the desire to help my father know himself more. But this person still has a different response. I'm glad to finally have the results in my hands. The anticipation had been building up. Now I can relax knowing. So one of the things that we took away from this study is that one is just a big difference in terms of Oklahoma. And so when we found people that got 0% Native American ancestry in Oklahoma, they responded very differently from the people who got 0% in New York or DC or Cincinnati. And you can very much understand that there was more at stake. So the motivations certainly influence people's response. And I'm going to tell you two quick stories about two men before I have to stop. And the one on the left, they have had very different experiences with genetic ancestry testing. The one on the left, I'm sure most of you don't know. Some of you may recognize the one on the right. But let's talk about the one on the left first. That's Wayne Joseph. He's a school superintendent in California. He did an ancestry test, has always identified as African American, lived his whole life, was an activist in black issues. Did an ancestry test, did a biogeographical ancestry test that showed that he was 57% Indo-European, so European, 39% Native American, 4% East Asian, and 0% African American. 0%. He was shocked. It's written up in a piece called Black Like I Thought I Was by Aaron. Very, very interesting piece written up in the LA Times, I think. And this was in 2003. So he got those results and didn't know what to do with them. He was shocked and trying to figure out what was going on. His whole identity was being shattered, lived his life as an African American and now getting this. And I've talked, both of them have participated in symposia that I've done on ancestry testing, been there in the audience, talking with people about their experiences. And one of the things I often ask Wayne is, so didn't you think about redoing the test? No, he didn't. But the interesting part of the story is he talked to his mother. So he asked his mother about this test result, and she said she's too old to even try to think about doing anything about this now. He talked to an aunt, and she said she's not surprised. What he came to find out, his family moved from Louisiana to Los Angeles when he was young. And his family chose to identify as black. So they really are white, Native American. His grandparents chose to identify as black because they did not want to identify with the oppressors. This was in the 1950s, 1960s, at a time when you can certainly know what was going on. They didn't want to identify with the oppressors, so they didn't want to be called white. So they chose to call themselves black. And they passed all these years. Everybody in the family identifies as black. And he grew up just thinking of himself as a black man. So when this came out, of course, it revealed the story that nobody knew but the grandparents. He has a brother who, he's like, yeah, I'm black. I don't care what the test says. I'm black, and I'm going to live my life as black. Wayne, on the other hand, has chosen a different route. He has chosen not to identify with any group. On census forms, he either puts other or he just doesn't fill it out. He's a-ethnic now or a-racial. He really does not pick anything. He said it's just confusing and it's shattered everything. He doesn't even want to deal with that. The person on the right, do people who know who that is? Isaiah Washington used to be on Grey's Anatomy. He did ancestry testing some years ago and found that his maternal lineage traced to Sierra Leone, to the Mende people in Sierra Leone. And he has he's started a foundation, a really great foundation to build schools and do health care and all these kinds of things in Sierra Leone. Has really taken it on as his home. And he's actually gotten citizenship in Sierra Leone. He is the first African American to get citizenship outside of the US based only on ancestry DNA testing. He's probably the first American, but be conservative, he and I often say he's the first African American. But he probably is the first. There are other countries like Ghana and Cameroon that I know are considering citizenship for people who trace their ancestry to that. But he has his passport, he's Sierra Leone. Those are his people. He's found his people. Those are his kin. Very interesting story. So to wrap up, and there's so many things that I could talk about, and I just picked a couple of things in terms of what we've learned from this study And just from my work on genetic ancestry testing, and we continue. The study that I described here, we now have a grant to follow these people. It's been 6 years since these people had ancestry testing. And so now we're calling them to see the impact that it's had on their lives, some of these people to see how their lives have changed or not since they've had the testing. We're also doing a national survey on ancestry testing, and then we're also doing a case study in Oklahoma with the Freedmen tribes and the Freedmen and the Native American tribes on ancestry testing. So it's clear that social, political, historical factors influence how people respond to these tests. These tests don't occur in a vacuum. And they also, many people also incorporate it in their whole lives. They don't just take the genetic information, for the most part. Some will. Some just take the genetics and say, science has said it's true. That's who I am. But people incorporate it in their whole being in terms of those people who are doing genealogy testing. And many don't take the test results as conclusive, which is one of the concerns that many bioethicists and social scientists have, that people won't interrogate this test and they'll just take it at face value. Motivations for testing clearly influences people's response. And the point there about public education, and I'm involved with the NIH and the Smithsonian we're going to work on some things in terms of public education about ancestry testing. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, why my brother did ancestry testing and I did ancestry testing, but his admixture test results are different from mine, right? Many people expect the same percentages if you're siblings, but we know that people inherit different parts of the genome, so you will get different percentages for just regular SIBs. And for me, one of the most important things in doing this work is that genetics, as much as I love it, I'm trained in genetics and I love the science, but it's not the be-all and end-all in terms of how people think about their identity and who they're related to and how we think about kinship. And that picture I'll put there, not just because the family is diverse, but because there are many Black Americans, I shouldn't say many, it's probably a small group of Black Americans that don't see President Obama as Black, as kin. When he was running for the election the first time, there was a group of people, and they wrote a lot of things about it too, that don't see him as Black or Black enough because his father did not come through the Middle Passage. His father is Kenyan, and his mother is white. So for many of them, he's not kin. He's not one of us. He's something else. Many of them don't define what that something else is. But the question about who is kin, it depends. It depends. I don't think, it depends on who's asking the question. It depends on which group you're trying to become part of. There are lots of things. He identifies as Black and African American, but some people really don't see him as part of the group, as part of the in crowd. And I just want us for me, it's really just thinking about kinship and ancestry testing in particular in a much broader way than the genetic information. There are lots more that we have to think about. I'm sorry for going over. Thank you.
It really does raise all sorts of questions about what identity is and how it relates to our beliefs versus what can be discovered and perhaps what is really present in our being. So there's a microphone in both aisles. Go ahead and come up to ask questions.
Hi. Really interesting talk. Thanks. I had a question about for example, Wayne, I'm sorry, I don't remember his last name.
Joseph.
I feel bad calling him Wayne. I don't know him.
You can call him
He's
Wayne.
not kin. Yeah, you know, he had his test done in 2003, and I would assume that in the ensuing 8 years or something, that the tests have gotten, I don't know, better, more comprehensive, there's more information. So is it possible, I mean, has anybody looked at, say, the early testing that was done at the beginning versus the testing that's going on now to see if there's differences between that because of the, you know, one would hope the improvement in, information.
Well, I know he hasn't, and he really does not plan to do anything with it. But we know that the tests have improved and people are getting more comprehensive databases. And the more comprehensive the databases, the more information you have. I know for sure for African ancestry, companies that are looking at African ancestry are getting lineages from different parts of Africa. Most of the lineages that have been in these databases that look at African ancestry, and I say that because it's the one I study most and know most about, have included West African lineages just from Nigeria and Ghana, which is where most African Americans come from. But we know that those are not the only places. There are places like Angola and other places that have not been represented in a lot of these databases. So people are trying to get lineages, and many of them are, so increasing the databases and the number of lineages. 23andMe also started this study that they're calling the 1,000 African American study or something, where they're getting 10,000 African Americans to increase the size of their database. They're offering them free testing, lots of issues with that, offering them free testing, but part of the goal is to increase the size of their database and the lineages there. So we know the information is changing, but I don't know to what extent. I mean, people are still, when we talk to people, even now, the people that we're interviewing now that did the testing in our study 6 years ago, many of them have gone from 1, 2, 3, 4 different companies getting different information. The question is which of those which information is valid. And one of the things even about the testing and the percentages that people are getting and the information that people get is that the, whoa, I just lost my train of thought. Oh my goodness. I forgot. Yeah, but oh my gosh. Can't remember. It'll come to me. I can't remember. I can't remember. It just slipped my mind. Sorry about that.
I have a two-part question, and I was just wondering, as technology advances, what type of technology will help increase the accuracy in ancestry testing? And do you believe that the databases will eventually have a standard database to reduce variance between companies, or will the companies just be really stubborn and not really do that?
You know, the companies in general are resistant to that. We're getting ready to engage them in some discussions, and that will be one of the things we talk to them about the value of having reproducible data and data that can be verified. Some of them are open to it, and they use their proprietary databases, but they use other databases out there like HapMap and the Human Genome Diversity Panel. They use a variety of public databases out there in conjunction with their own proprietary databases. And companies like 23andMe also work with universities and so have access to their databases as well. So they do a variety of things in terms of their databases. And I do think that there might be some middle ground that they come to in terms of how they look at the database issue, because a lot of people have raised issues about and concerns about the proprietary databases, that other scientists can't go in and see if what you're calling Yoruba is really what I'm calling Yoruba. And the number of markers that people are using vary so much from company to company. So there probably will be some things. I think whole genome sequencing could change some of what we're seeing, although whole genome sequencing raises a lot of issues in terms of the amount of data and the amount of information and what we can even do with it. But it would be an ideal way of looking at ancestry across the genome as opposed to just looking at parts of the genome. So it has the potential to do that, but it's still costly. And many companies are not able to do that now. That's still very much an academic exercise in terms of whole genome and ancestry.
So how good are those Native American markers?
That's a good question. So when people look at, and I don't even know how to answer the question about how good they are, because Native Americans will tell you they're not good at all. But the thing about Native American ancestry is that, for the most part, and I don't know if companies are able to do that now, but for the most part, they're not able to tell you what tribe, right? They're just able to say you're Native American, you have lineage from Native American companies. They're probably as good as much of the other data, although for African and European ancestry, we have a lot more. Well, African, because you have people who have been focusing on that, but in general, African ancestry information is still quite limited. But there are concerns about needing, and the questions about the data, the Native American data, I would say, certainly are not as robust as they could be, partly because there are not a lot of lineages in there, because Native Americans in many places have not been participating in research and not donating their information to be part of these databases. Some Native American tribes, and I won't say all, but some are increasingly getting involved in genetics, whether they'll be part of ancestry testing, because ancestry testing for many Native American tribes raises a lot of issues about questions of migration and land ownership and all those kinds of things. But many of them are getting involved in genomic research more generally. And might be part of that. I think there's a big concern that Native American tribes have contributed to research projects, and their DNA has become part of these databases, and they're not getting anything from it. The companies are making a lot of money. So there's a question about benefit sharing, and do we get anything back from this? I mean, that is a whole another story, another talk.
Well, we do have time for one more question, and I have one if no one else is going to stand up. So I was really interested by sort of some of the things he said, you wouldn't have time to talk about them. And one of them was the issue of whether there is a biological basis to the notion of race.
Yes.
And I'm not a geneticist, I'm not a biologist, but I've done a lot of reading on this, and I feel persuaded that there is not a biological way to make those kinds of categories. Nonetheless, I had sort of thought of ancestry as something that can be, in a sense, tied to particular continents. And I guess when I think about race as something that does have reality in a social sphere, something that people do live in certain ways, make decisions that are related to it, and also have decisions made for them that are related to these categorizations, right? So I guess the question is something like, what does the real fact that one can find out now that one didn't come from the geographical area with which one has associated one's cultural upbringing and which other people have associated with one's cultural upbringing, how does that push on that notion of kind of the biology question with regard to race? But I ask because of the people who seem to be making choices about what to do next based on what they find out, right?
That's
If we think of this as something cultural, why not say, hey, this is the culture that I've been identified with, it's the culture I grew up with. What does the data tell you?
All right. So there's a group of social scientists, bioethicists, who critique race and critique this work, and one of their main concerns is the reification of race, right? So we say race is not biological. We say human groups do not subdivide into biological races. But at the same time, we're using genetic technology, biological, to tell people that they come from different continents. So the genetic ancestry testing both reifies and nullifies the notion of race. When we talk to a lot of people who get a result that says, people who identify as Black American, African American, and they get a result that says they're 80% African American, 10% European American, this Native American, whatever, those people will say, oh my gosh, that we are all mixed up. So it really helps people to see that there's no pure anything. So we get a bit of that, and there are people who change. There's this woman that we interviewed that has changed how she answers the census, because she doesn't just put Black, she puts Native American, she puts white, she said, I put all of me now. So I don't know what we're going to do with that. So it is a complex question. I think in one way it could help us to see that we're all related and that none of us is pure anything, that we're all mixed up. The reification part of race, I really don't see it necessarily as being conflicting. in one sense. Because when we say there's no biological basis for race, it means that you cannot look at DNA and compartmentalize groups into what we call races, that this is a race and that is a race. But the information that's used in admixture mapping is based on DNA sequences that are more common in populations. And we see that. We know that that occurs. We know that there are variants that are more common, the Duffy null, more common in people of African ancestry than other populations. It doesn't mean it's absent from other populations. So I think it's just how we explain what we're doing. It's not all or none, right? It's how much because most variants, we will find them in all populations. But we don't find, for the most part, we don't find variants that are unique to one population and not in other. So I think it's just how we craft the message that we're saying. I don't think they conflict. I think they actually reinforce the notion that we don't have biological races.
Thank you very much.